All right, let's talk shoulder training, specifically how to build bigger, stronger shoulders and do it smart.
Bolder shoulders.
Yeah, bolder shoulders. I mean, who doesn't want a good set of shoulders? It's just like arms. Like everybody wants to have good looking shoulders and arms.
Shoulders are sexy.
Fill out the t-shirt or under the tank top. Again, for you guys when you're wearing your sundresses, those things.
They look so, dude, it's just a big one for me is the side raises before I go out in this.
I gotcha. Mm-hmm. See a lot of things going on with shoulder training.
It's horrendous.
Probably one of the most overtrained, misunderstood areas of the body.
Oh my God.
Let's look at it from the bodybuilding perspective first.
All right.
And just in terms of building mass and building symmetry throughout the shoulder.
Making sure they don't break.
So I think just the quick overview is let's keep this kind of high level with regard to kind of what how that shoulder is built. If we're looking at the deltoid, there's a medial, lateral, and posterior piece to that.
Correct.
It would be a crime to say that was all we really needed to know, because the shoulder is a very, very complex joint in and of itself. But we're looking at the musculature and how people are developing in that. There's a lot of things that get left out. And again, there's a lot of things that are often overtrained. So let's just talk about delts and let's stay in that realm.
Okay.
If I want bigger delts, medial, posterior, lateral, give me, like, Caleb, your favorite go-to exercises.
Okay. Well, there are like multiple trains of thought here. At least we'll start with the front and work our way backwards. So anterior delts get worked really well with pressing, So like, you mean like overhead shoulder pressing? Like overhead shoulder pressing, incline bench pressing, even flat bench pressing to a degree, although, less so. And for a long time, I was kind of in the camp where the anterior delts get so much training, so much secondary stimulus from all the pressing we as bodybuilders do that we don't need to isolate them. And so my front delts suck. So I'm remedying that now, and I am working in some isolation movements. So for the front delts, a big issue I see is just like form for overhead pressing. We got to talk about the overhead press because that is going to be your bread and butter for building the medial delts. People will say that, it stimulates the lateral delts too. And depending on your setup, then a little bit of posterior, at least from a stabilization standpoint. And that's true. But as far as like overloading
and stimulus,
you're not really overloading the medial and posterior aspect of the shoulder when you're doing overhead presses, which is fine. So from a bodybuilding perspective, I really like a setup where you're seated, first of all, so you're braced better. And you're not truly pressing overhead like a standing military press. But really more pressing like diagonally upward. So you're at a very steep incline as opposed to being straight up and down.
So let me get this. So you're actually going to be leaning up against something.
Correct.
Right. And you're braced sort of like you're leaning up against a piece of equipment.
Or like a bench.
A bench. Incline bench or something.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Got it.
And so that way, you can keep your feet braced on the ground as well. Make sure your whole body is really rigid. And then the big issue with pressing is that people like to, especially with dumbbell pressing, I'm just going to use that as kind of our avatar for this, is elbows end up way out 90 degrees, super far. I'm going to let Jeff talk about why that is not good. But if we want the anterior delts to be doing most of the work and not putting a bunch of stress on the coracoid or something like that. The
coracoid process, or coracoid.
So we got AC joint in the CCC, right? You got your sternoclavicular, and you got your AC joint. So when we're talking about pressing in a T motion, where my shoulders are lined up with my elbows, and I literally look like a T, and this is what you see everyone doing when they're bench pressing. It's not the functionality of the shoulder. And it's not the way the humerus was designed to move with the scapula. Okay. We have something that's called a scapular plane. Mm-hmm. This is where we want that upper arm to live in pressing movements and rowing movements. And it's a 45-degree angle. And it actually depends on where my shoulder blade is. And it can change depending on my retraction or my protraction. Right. So being aware of where your normal and where your neutral is at for your shoulder health. Everybody's shoulder is going to be different. With the pressing motion, we never want to start flaring out, right? My arm is almost always tucked into that 45-degree position. As I start pressing, my elbow is coming forward out to the side as I start breaking the bar over my head, and then the elbows start to do a little flare. What you start to see now is because the elbows are flared, people start coming down in this T motion. They're not allowed.
So the elbow starts to travel down, but behind the shoulder.
And instead of coming back down into that 45-degree scapular plane, right, that it's supposed to be going into. And if you actually look at the deltoid and the fiber alignment, that's the way that it wants to be lined up, right? So if we want to, Caleb talks about lining the arm up or lining the line of force up with the muscle. Well, why are we going to flare out our shoulders, right? I want to have...
I think that often, I can tell you why.
I was going to say.
The reason people are doing that is because they're pushing loads that they can't handle.
For sure.
And so they're leaning up against that bench, and it's oftentimes that little L seat that you can find sitting in the corner of the gym, right? You can drag it over in front of the dumbbell rack. And then what they do is they prop their butt and their hips way out on the edge of that thing. And then they get into thoracic and lumbar extension, and they plant their scaps right on the top of that bench. Somehow they figure out a way to finagle themselves out there. Legs are doing all kinds of crazy shit. And now their spine looks like an S, right? As it's coming up,
booty.
Like the bottom side of an S, it's so arched back, and then they have to do that to balance the load that they have because they don't have the mobility and or the strength in order to keep that weight where you just described in that plane of motion. And then it turns into basically like an incline press.
Exactly.
They're relying on the leverage from pulling the humeral head like way back in the glenohumeral joint, right?
Right.
And so what happens is they're not able to get all the way down. And if they are, then there's a ton of stress on their shoulder. And like Jeff was saying, it doesn't line up with the fibers of the anterior delt. So it's not even really, don't get me wrong, huge guys do that, right? And it's worked for them, but is it the most optimal way? No. Do they probably have shoulder issues because of it?
Yeah.
And so,
I do because of doing those for so many 100%. Years as a young.
If I grabbed a dumbbell and did it right now, I guarantee you my biceps tendon would tighten up.
You're gonna feel it.
I guarantee it.
Yeah. So like Olympic weightlifters have known this shit for years, right? They keep everything in front. Like you don't see a guy, somebody jerking a barbell over their head with their elbows behind them.
Right.
Like physically you can't do that, right? You take your chin and your nose off if you did that, but it stays out in front. So the barbell press, overhead press, there's pros and cons to having your hands fixed to that bar, particularly if you don't have shoulder mobility or you have poor shoulder health or whatever. It will take you will be forced to stay in, especially standing, right? Because if you lean back too far, like you're not braced or whatever,
right.
You're forced to stay in that plane or that range that your body can use or can utilize. So, if you want to find out what your shoulder mobility looks like, stand strictly with maybe a little bit. You can't use like a dowel rod because there's not enough feedback there. You can easily control that. But put that a little bit heavier barbell in your hands and see where your elbows are in relation to your shoulders, because they should be right underneath that barbell, right underneath your wrists, right? Yeah. And then try to push that thing overhead and get it all the way over your head. And that'll give you a pretty good indication what your mobility and your strength is or isn't. I'm not saying that that's a great assessment, but it is a way real quick to kind of know, well, why would I do this differently if I had dumbbells in my hands?
Sure. External rotation.
Right. Yep. Yeah, the external rotation of the shoulder. Anyhow.
So that first of all, I'm really glad that Jeff was able to go over the scapular plane, because that way I don't have to. And I think that he explained it a lot better than I could anyway.
So we were talking about medial delts and the how much work front delts and how much work they get in our pressing movements, right?
Right. And so when you mentioned the standing overhead press, one of the reasons that I don't find that the most optimal for shoulder training is because the final few degrees where you're bringing your arm from kind of right, I don't know if you can see the camera, but right, where you're fully extending it overhead, there's a lot of low trap that's pulling your shoulders into that position. And then, it's not like your front delts aren't doing anything, but it's just, it
almost unloads them.
A little bit. Yeah, exactly. And so by using a really steep incline bench and making sure that you allow your scapula to move freely, because it does need to rotate freely. And a big mistake people make, like you mentioned, Scott, is pinning their traps back against the bench. We're able to line things up so that when we press and our arms are fully extended, it's not truly overhead, but they are vertical to the ground. The load is still all on the anterior delt. Right. So they're doing all of the work from top to bottom.
Right.
And so also what Caleb's talking about is the way he's positioning the body to keep the force on the muscle throughout the entire range at the top, so you're not losing. You can think of something like maybe a landmine lining up. So like a Viking press or something. Ben Pollock does this a lot. slide incline up, right? Has a Viking press. If you guys don't know what that is, it's a strongman. It's also called a core blaster, but it's just a handle that comes onto the bar, the end of the barbell. It allows for a lot more neutral shoulder pressing movement to the outside, and also for just wider, bigger guys. But it is going to allow you, as you go overhead, especially with the angle and then the angle of the landmine or whatever you're pivoting the weight off of, you're constantly in tension overhead. You're not losing that front delt.
Yep.
I actually didn't even think about that. That's a really good.
And so these are things, guys. Like, is the overhead press bad? No, but like
is
he going to try to grow his front delt? Like, this is what the things that we need to think about, and it's the intention of the exercise that dictates all. So you might go into the gym and see somebody doing something and be like, dude, this guy's a fucking idiot. But you haven't even asked his intention. Right. You have no idea what his programming is.
What's he training for?
What's he doing? Is he in there working out because he's going to murder somebody and this is like his like fucking relaxing? Or is like, dude, like he's doing that for a fucking reason, right? So like,
or he's training to murder somebody.
Exactly. Right?
Again, there are no bad exercises.
So when we look at,
bad application.
The front shoulder or the overhead press, right? One might be more functional, right? Because I need this low trap to be pulling my shoulder blade back and working, right? Whereas it's a different, I might need my client to have a better shoulder health, right? So I'm teaching them as they go overhead, hey, how do the shoulder blades work and move as one? Whereas the bodybuilder, let's get your front delts going. Yep. And this is how we need to leverage the body to do that, right? Yep. And it's all going to be different. The intention's going to be different from powerlifting to Olympic lifting to bodybuilding, mobility training. Every intention is different. And you guys people need to understand that, right?
And that goes back to like the choosing the exercise. Yeah. So you were on the train of, you mentioned earlier when we started, you were on the train of, I get a lot of front pressing, or an overhead pressing, so I'm not doing as much, or I wasn't doing as much isolated front delt work.
Correct.
So let's go back to that now. So now you're doing more front delt work.
Now I am.
And what is that? Like, what's your favorite front delt exercise?
I'm not gonna lie, my shoulders are not the best health wise. I'm working on actively correcting that, but part of bodybuilding training means really trying to develop your lats and your chest, both of which are very strong internal rotators. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of kind of cranking on my shoulder joint that I'm working.
Listen
now.
up, kids. Listen up.
Yeah. So do your rehab, take it seriously. And if you can't afford to go get body work done, learn how to do it yourself.
It's free.
Yeah. Just take some time and thought. Anyway, so now what I'm doing is a single arm front raise, again with a cable. The way I'm lighting it up is in a way where the cable is positioned behind me, and so the front delt is it's being overloaded in its lengthened position. Mm-hmm. Because if you think about it, when you're doing any kind of a press, the delt is doing the most work at the top at lockout, right? That's where it gets progressively harder and harder and harder as you go. So what I'm doing is having the cable oriented behind me. It's not totally vertical, not totally horizontal, but a little bit more horizontal than vertical. So the start of the rep is more difficult than the finishing of the rep. And so when I fail, I can't really do a partial because I fail at the bottom of the movement. I found it complements the overhead pressing that I'm doing very nicely. I'm also just doing more overhead pressing now. Similar to the arm conversation we had where, or what we are going to talk about when we talk about lateral delts is, it's a small muscle. It only does one thing, right? It just contracts in this one kind of range of motion. And so since we can't really train it through shorter or longer lengths, what we can do is choose where in the motion we overload it.
So let's talk about that.
Okay.
So we're talking medial. So we just moved from front delt, which was that front shoulder raise.
Correct.
Cable application. And you guys can see that in our YouTube video that we just shot with you. But so your arm's coming out in front of you, and now we're moving to lateral delts.
Sure.
Right. And so you mentioned the lateral delt does, or medial delt, sorry. Medial delt does kind of one thing. It's very isolated. What does it do?
Correct.
It's shoulder abduction.
Abduction. Right? Yep. Correct. Yeah.
So abduction.
So it's
moving the arm away from the midline of the body.
Yep. Yeah. And an important thing to point out is this is also happening in the scapular plane. So it's not like a T, like Jeff talked about with the overhead pressing. The same thing. You'll see people with their arms totally out to the sides, and that's not really how.
It's not in line with the fiber at all.
Exactly. And so it ends up being much more of like a kind of scapular elevation exercise. Like
so you end up seeing
subscaps,
your traps, subscapulars, and supraspinatus ends up working overtime right there.
Supraspinatus.
And that's part of the rotator cuff. Most people don't know about it until they fucked it up, until they've irritated the shit out of it. Yeah. And it's from overworking through that muscle and to get that abduction through the shoulder, through the humerus, right? So what ends up happening is all that the overload starts to move into very tiny muscle that runs along the spine of the scap there, and to move your entire arm and whatever's connected to your arm.
Yeah.
So instead of going straight out to the side, it moves in and you just mentioned the scapular plane. Where should the arm be in relation to the shoulder?
The common trope is about 45 degrees. Really, it's a range, maybe 50 to 60 degrees. It's going to be different for everybody based on how their bones are literally built.
Right. So when you're lifting that arm up, then the hand, like if you're thinking kind of in relation, and your elbow may be slightly bent here, but the hand's going to be in front of the waist.
Absolutely.
Right? It's going to be in front of your body.
Just 1,000%.
Yeah. So the hands are coming out to the front.
Because if you think of your setup, for me, I'm slightly leaned forward in my torso. The dumbbells are in front of me.
Sure.
Right. I've got my lats flared, and I practice pulling my arms off my lats as I come
away,
keeping the shoulders out of my ears. Right. Right. Not allowing
you're not shrugging.
The trap is going to do some work.
Of course.
Right? But you don't want to have it going into some concentric contraction. Right.
Sure. Yeah. So, just like the front delt, I like to try to overload the lateral delt in its lengthened position, or more lengthened position, and overload it in its most shortened position. So traditional dumbbell lateral raises are a great way to overload it in the shortened position. If you've ever done dumbbell lateral raises before, which I'm sure you have if you're listening to this, you are aware that it is hardest to complete the rep at the top. So if you are getting close to failure, you can do partials where you only get the weight about halfway up. And then, so that's a way you can tell, like, if you're ever wondering if an exercise is overloading every exercise overloads a specific range of a movement, a specific portion of that movement. That's how you can tell, where do I fail in the movement? So dumbbell lateral raises are great, and so figuring out how to overload the lateral delt in its more lengthened position is harder, but not impossible. So if I do like a cable lateral raise where the cables again are oriented behind me, I can move my arm through that scapular plane. Just like with dumbbells, it's easier at the top and hardest at the bottom. So when I first lift my arm from next to my side, that's where it's most difficult. And so when I fail, that's where I'm going to stop. That's actually something I've only recently introduced, but it's something I've been looking into for a while.
I love that. You're still exploring.
Yeah, well, I mean, always. I'll always have to be, because new ideas are always coming out. This is something that like Kasim Hansen has talked about a ton in his N1 stuff.
Yeah, I love that guy.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, those two are the most practical. I mean, there are other implements you can use, right? You can use cables for your overloading at the top, the shortest position.
You're talking the lateral.
Still lateral,
head.
yeah.
So people know those as like delt
Side
raises,
delts,
side delts.
Yeah. But I mean, just those two, I think. Shoulders recover really, really fast, which also means that a stimulus is no longer novel very quickly for them relative to something else. If you switch to a new quadricep exercise, like you switch from a hack squat to a new kind of leg press, you're going to get novel gains from that for a good, like several weeks, if not a couple months, because, it's a new exercise, very disruptive.
Right.
But lateral delts recover so freaking quickly that they will get used to that, the new mechanics of this exercise. And so having something different that you can rotate out more frequently is something that's beneficial for everybody.
That's a really great point. So it's again, that's due to the complexity of the joint and kind of how, or the joint itself, right? And those muscles and how we've evolved to, we use them in everything. If you're moving during the day, if the arm moves at all, your shoulder has to work, right? Yeah. So that's a very good point in terms of giving. There's a frequency, there's a volume, there's a frequency, and then there's also the variety of things that you can be thrown at it.
And they're also not that big muscles.
No, they're not. They're very. I mean, on some people are obviously bigger than others, but they are in comparison to. I mean, your quadricep example, which is massive. Yep. Those are the biggest group of muscles we've got. So, in comparison. So, and those don't work. They don't work in isolation. They work with other things. We've already tapped into that, and you guys got to be careful that those bigger muscles that are attached, go back to the traps, right? As an example, those will take over in that overloading process. Sure. Once the muscles or the deltoid itself is fatigued or cannot handle that load anymore. So, being smart about how much load you're using within the frequency and the volume is important in the variety of whatever you're doing. But I don't want to, I don't want to pass or miss rear delts or posterior delts.
Like many do.
It's so important.
Oh, they look so good.
And it's the worst. Of all of the nuance that you've been talking about here, this is the one I see getting fucked up the most.
All day.
Yeah.
All day.
So let's talk about rear delts. What's your favorite rear delt exercise?
Again, always something with cables. I mean, yeah, all I can say is cable rear delt flies. I like to set them up in a way where the cables the cable outlets are above my head a little bit, hinge my hips
So slightly above the joint.
Slightly above, and bring them downward. I bet Jeff can actually articulate why that lines up with the muscle fibers better and the actual actions of that muscle. But I've just found it to be the most effective as far as getting the delts through their full range of motion without feeling it too much in my scapular muscles. Yes, of course I feel it in my traps. There's no way to avoid that. Yes, I do feel it in my external rotators to a degree, depending on how I'm rotating my humerus. But as far as actually getting the rear delts fully shortened and loaded in that shortened position, that's the money.
Yeah, you're talking. So they make machines that do this, right? You have the pec fly that
The
people
reverse pec deck.
Yeah, they've flipped around, and I've seen
There's
any
only
kind
a
of
couple
version.
I've been on that I like.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that because it looks to be the same exercise, right? This thing's targeting the same things. I'm moving in the same direction. Tell me the difference between the cables and that rear or that reverse fly or pec deck. So what's happening?
Well, when you're on the machine, it's going to be a fixed plane, right? And each individual, if your anatomy works, if it works, it works. If and people don't know, so they're on this machine. It's like, dude, it's not the best for you. Where you're on your cable, you're setting yourself up, right? And I think whenever you're going to set yourself up and you're going to pay attention, again, intention and drive, you're going to have a better result. Now, do I use machines? Yeah, but it's on my active fucking recovery days, dude. It's not. I'm not going
to bodybuild on
chest day and walking to the incline hammer strength machine and putting 3 plates on it, dude. I'm not. If you ever see me on machine, I probably have like a quarter, maybe a 45, and I'm going through full motion, getting a little pump, and I'm getting out. Because I'm a full body trainer right now. I do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I do little touches like we're talking about frequency. So machines for me, they don't create that much. For me, they don't create that much damage, right? And gotcha. I prefer a barbell and a dumbbell because one, I have to stabilize it myself. And I think that is the bigger piece of what we're doing, right? When you're on the machine, you can just sit there and kind of look around and stabilize it for you, right? Again,
there's pros and cons to that, right? But I think one of the cons that you mentioned there is that these machines are not designed for everybody.
Yeah.
And that might not fit your body the right way. Axis rotation may be off. The plane of motion could be off.
Yeah.
There's lots of different things there. But one of the things I see on there is like people go there because they can overload the shit out of it, right? Because or at least seemingly.
For sure.
They're trying to do that. They're trying to overload. And what you end up seeing is these weird postures, right? You see kind of throwing the weight back.
Yeah.
Tons of like rhomboid work happening, because they don't have to worry about stabilizing it at the bottom, right? Of that movement. Like they can come all the way down and let the stack touch, right? And it takes the tension off, which is awkward or weird that they would even be letting it do that. And then, they're doing different things with their
grip.
Yeah, with their grip, right? So you're seeing like an overhand or pronated grip. You're seeing, neutral grips. I've even seen people trying to do that with a supinated grip, which is really awkward.
Well, let's talk about that.
If you don't have that range of motion,
I would say that supinated possibly could be the best for the rear delt training when you're looking at functionality and then health.
But how do you really overload that muscle in that?
You could be on an incline bench, slightly forward, and you're just coming back into extension. So holding the dumbbell.
Oh, so you're talking about with dumbbells?
Yeah, dumbbells.
Still okay.
Yeah.
So we're not on the machine.
Sorry. I left the machines. My bad.
But I've seen people trying to do that.
No,
which is totally awkward because you usually can't get that seat up high enough to even be in that position without hitting your head on the cams that are above you on that particular machine. Right. I digress. The point of this is being smart about your rear delt training. You like cables because it allows you to move through the range that you have. Sure. You can really focus on those muscles without overloading. You're not stabilized, right, against a machine or a piece of equipment, which can be, there's a pro and a con to that. Probably absolutely. There are different things that you can do to do that. Maybe laying on an incline bench, doing a similar movement with dumbbells or with cables, because you could set up the cables coming from low.
That's my favorite.
Right, to that same position, kind of at 45 degrees or whatever you chose.
Yeah.
But the point of that being is you're able to really focus on keeping tension through that muscle or those muscles for the entirety of the exercise versus, again, because we're not working against gravity in the same direction. We've changed the direction of gravity, if you will, with the pulleys and the cams. So I like that exercise too. It's one of my favorites. I see the bent over seated on the bench or forehead at the end of an incline bench. People with dumbbells trying to figure out a way to really get into those rear delts. And again, there's no bad exercise there, but what I see is a lot of flailing.
Oh, for sure.
And obviously at the bottom, it's hanging, and it's not hanging against your rear delts anymore.
Correct.
Yeah. It's hanging against your upper thoracic musculature that's keeping those scaps basically from being ripped off your body, right? Yep. Lats are working a little bit. Your traps are definitely working a bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what you're targeting. But I'm not choosing those exercises, those bent over dumbbell exercises, to train my delts.
In general, no.
I'm not. I'm using them to train my upper middle back.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. But they all, to also play devil's advocate, right? I'm never going to be able to fully isolate a movement, muscle,
correct.
right?
You can't.
It's always going to be an accentuation of, okay, I got this fiber line more or less here or there, right? So when I look at training the rear delts, I actually don't mind getting my traps and everything moving, because when I
they work together.
Yeah, and I was talking to Caleb earlier, like adding external rotation at the end. Like for me, I actually do dumbbell slide on the incline, where I'm really focusing on coming up at a 45-degree angle, and at the top getting into an external rotation, but making sure, this is very hard.
You're talking about prone.
Yeah,
prone,
and it'd be a prone, and very hard to make sure the elbow's not lifting or dropping when we're going into that external rotation and staying in that line.
Sure.
I'm using 10-pound dumbbells, you know what I'm saying? But really focusing on that movement and just being able to get everything in an accordance for me over time. I feel that I have built better rear delts than trying to isolate them, in my opinion.
Gotcha.
I think trying to isolate them invites a lot of potential for shoulder dysfunction too.
Exactly.
Because, I mean, the humerus,
locked in the shoulders
humerus moves to such a small degree, backwards like that and into abduction, and extension. It doesn't make sense to try to isolate it and not allow the scapula to move. The main thing is you just want to make sure that force is being applied in a direction where the rear delts have the best leverage and the scapula, the traps don't. And so the way you do that is just make sure you're not trying to direct force straight back, which is a big problem with that. Going back to the reverse pec deck, is that when you try to lock out, it's all backwards. You're applying force directly back behind your body. And so your traps have the best leverage for that. So they're
going to take over.
Yep. Right. Yeah. So with the cables, I like it. And you can do this with dumbbells as well, as long as you know how to, is I'm pulling my hands out to the sides away from me, almost like I'm trying to touch the walls on either side of me. As a result, they automatically move backwards because of the way I have the cables oriented. And just the fact that that's the way the humerus moves when you're in that position. But if you're applying force diagonally backwards as opposed to straight back, your rear delts, even at the top, will be doing the majority of the work, or at least as much as they are physically capable of doing, being small muscles. The traps are assisting only as much as is necessary.